Okay. You know, I don't know if you guys got the note I sent yesterday to Connie, but basically the suggestion is that you guys are going to drive this conversation more than I'm going to drive it. I cannot get specific on answers to the actual spreadsheet itself, except to maybe give you a little pusher or starter, or refer back to the in-class example to give you kind of, you know, the 30,000-foot view of what certain concepts were that you might not have grasped during class that are, you know, kind of giving you more problems now that you look at the assignment. So don't think I'm trying to be kind of, you know, problematic in my answers, but I can't, I've been given instructions per se to not give the answers because it's not a, you know, conversational assignment that you can collaborate on to that degree. So I would basically be breaching that as well if I did so. All that said, I'm going to do what I can for you. So I think maybe the best place to start is to look at some of Howard's questions, which I think all of you got yesterday, his set of questions. Is that right? Mm-hmm. And as the situation goes on, feel free to jump in and we'll sidestep Howard's questions and come back to them because, you know, I'd rather take a lot of questions too. What are you guys finding so far? You liking it? Is it a lot different from the original that we did in class? What are you thinking? Don't be shy.
Well, I think
Albert, don't be shy.
I mean, I understand that there's some red herrings in here, or maybe part of the process is that we have to think through some of the questions that I may have asked. So I just want to make clear I wasn't looking to get answers, but part of it really does seem unclear to me if you're looking at this, and that's what generates. So I read this and I read this again. And I said, if I'm done. So I started to set out the assumptions and look at the problem. And I think there is some clarification that's needed.
There are some flat-out inconsistencies in the language itself. Let me go through what I believe you should be looking at. I think paragraph 4 is where you guys are going to have the most problems in the assignment itself. The large paragraph, obviously. Let's walk through it, okay? And I think this might be a good place to start. That might answer a lot of your questions that you have to this point. It's not going to answer everything, I know that, but. So, building will have an average year 1 vacancy of 20%. Pretty self-explanatory at that point. Where are you going to, well, okay, let's. So, I'll walk through vacancies with you a little bit here. This much I feel like I can do because it's based on an assumption at least. And because he kind of screwed up a little bit of what it should be saying, I think we should all be on the same page in this. Okay. What's our vacancy in year 1?
20%.
Based on?
The building will have an average year 1 vacancy of 20%.
That's pretty, somewhat just Larry King softball question there. Yeah, it says it right directly. Now, you could get hypersensitive and hyperreactive to something like that and say, well, it doesn't matter when that 20% is exactly, you know, if it's like 100% on day 1, but, you know, 0% for a large portion of that year, doesn't that affect your numbers? The answer is yeah, it does. But this is not a perfect science. A pro forma is an estimate through and through to the best you can make it. And if you went monthly, which is possible in a pro forma as much as it is annually, you would get a little more precise. But the argument I've got for you here is keep it simple. This is annual. And what you're learning here is giving you the basic theme of the things you're looking at in a pro forma. Okay, so don't be thrown by the idea that it's an average. Go by the fact that year 1 vacancy on a pro forma is going to be showing at 20%. Okay. So you operate.
Just on that, I mean, so if I'm reading it right, it's as if on day 1 vacancies were were 20% and stayed that way throughout the entire term,
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
At least for
for purposes of this
a
exercise.
hypothetical, and even, Howard, you've seen pro formas before. They don't break it down into,
Right.
well, things changed inside that year. You are looking at basically the average. And so by capturing an average, you're hopefully capturing at least a close estimate as to what the valuations should be, the operating income should be, et cetera. Maybe expenses too, for that matter. Okay, since you've operated value-added fund, your strategy is to lease up the building to 95% occupancy and then sell it at a profit. Translate what that means ultimately on the flip side. What are we looking to do in that building?
Fill it up and sell it.
Okay, true. And to what degree are we expecting to fill it up?
95%.
Which means our vacancy will be?
5%.
Okay, so at some point we're going to go from 20 down to 5 hopefully in the pro forma. At least that's the expectation. Next sentence. You assume that you will increase occupancy by 4% in year 1, 6% in year 2, and 5% in year 3, whereupon from year 4 onward the occupancy stabilizes at 95%. So somebody take me through where we're going from here.
Go from 20%, and then the next year it would be 16, and then it would go to 10, and then it'll go year 4 through 7 is 5%.
Okay, now for spreadsheet purposes, there is no way to capture simplistically or formulaically some way to reduce these. So you're basically going to state exactly this inside your cells. It's just a further assumption to a certain degree. And it's something that you're going to need to put in, obviously, from what you've seen already. Because what does this vacancy affect when it gets down to it?
Rent.
Effective gross income.
Okay, what else?
Everything.
Everything.
Net
Yeah,
operating
yeah,
income.
let's-
Operating,
Share of expenses.
Oh.
expenses.
There you go.
Expenses.
I want you to use the terms, because that's as important here as anything else.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I thought it was off.
So, operating expenses, what else? What,
Operating income, net operating
Ending
income.
balance.
okay, keep going. There are other things in this example that we may not have seen before that it may affect too. Give me some terminology I want you to spew at me.
Your annual rate, rent, monthly rent,
Keep going,
Gross to taxable income.
keep going.
cash flow, cash on cash
Go to the next
return.
sentence, specifically.
Uh,
Does it affect what's in the next sentence?
So we just do the potential gross income.
Did someone mention the TI?
Say again?
The TI?
And what else?
Commissions?
Okay, good. And what do we kind of call those, the expenses per se? They're not operating expenses. What are
Capital costs.
they? That's good, I like that. Yeah, more specifically because they're referring kind of to the same,
Leasing and capital, the LCC, is that?
yeah, or stabilization expenses too is what I was looking at.
We didn't go over, we didn't have that.
Understood, understood. And again, he understands that, and this is one of those things where you can look it up on the internet or ask the question generally, and I'm happy to talk about it at this point. But I'm not going to necessarily give you the exact application of it because there is some thinking that has to be done here. And this is why I told you on day one, let me just finish what I'm going to say here. On day one I told you, it's not an exercise of just putting numbers into a spreadsheet. You got to be understanding what we're trying to portray in these spreadsheets, okay? And so when you're thrown in a pro forma, Howard will tell you this, there are always nuances and variances from one spreadsheet to another that you're going to have to be ready to either put in yourself or understand why it's in there. So we're trying to get you to think like a practitioner in this respect and at least try to understand where things go and why they're going there. That said, go ahead.
Yeah, so for the LCC, those expenses, that would be put into the cash flow formula, correct? Is that?
Well, don't jump ahead too far yet. Well, let's kind of go a little more linearly if we can. And if I haven't hit that question at that point, then
I'm gonna calculate it first and figure.
I have a question, very simple. What is this LCC everyone keeps speaking of.
Okay, somebody, it seems like you have a grasp of some.
In
what
the
LCC is.
notes, which it say leasing and capital costs, it includes tenant improvements, leasing commissions, and capital reserve.
Oh, so you're just abbreviating
Yeah,
leasing
in
and
the,
capital costs.
leasing,
Got it.
yeah. So these are just other expenses. In the last hypo we did, the one in class, it didn't have any leasing and capital costs. The only expense were, the tenant fees per square foot. So I guess this is another thing we have to, calculate that we didn't do last time. And I know that LCC, that gets involved in the cash flow formula. That's net operating income subtracted by the LCC. That gets put into the net operating,
Okay.
cash flow formula.
In my love of football, I'm gonna call for this, a timeout.
Was that wrong?
No, nothing's wrong, but let's, to a lot of people, I think you're spewing things that they're not quite catching yet, so
I
let's.
don't understand it either.
Yeah, so I'm gonna pull the brake a little bit on this one and say, let's keep going now a little bit forward. It's a good question. Now, I said, instead of calling it LCC, I'm calling it stabilization. That portion of it, I'm calling stabilization. There's another portion, once we get past this year, or into this year, basically, and what are the other numbers called that are referred to later on in that paragraph? Or what's another nickname that you could give them? You have stabilization numbers, and then what does he call the rest? I go
We'll
to,
still do the stabilization, and that's.
that's one way. I'm calling it rollover expenses. Also a type of LCC, but at the same time, they have been specially delineated in this example, so I think you need to be aware of both of them instead of just putting the general theme of LCC over the top of them to understand what's happening in this example, okay? But don't try to be careful about mixing these when you know that they are delineated to this degree. Now in real life, Howard will tell you, you're always going to have stabilization and rollover simultaneously. What's happening here, I always explain it like this. When you build a new building, you're going to take on tenants for leases of 3 to 5 years most likely, in especially a corporate world or a commercial lease situation. I just did one, an extension that became a 10-year extension on a lease. That was originally a 10-year lease that got 2 years cut short because of a bankruptcy scenario. So, even that is short term, saying 3 to 5 years. So we're saying we're locking in people here, 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 because on year 0 we signed leases on January for January 1st that lasted basically 3 to 5 years, and so this is where you're starting to see rollover finally because their leases are expiring, so they're getting out of them now. Of course, that's oversimplistic. People or companies go bankrupt and leave the space, or they get evicted for whatever reason. But again, this is to try to give you a hands-on view of the different things you'll see. They will integrate with each other, but it's better to separate them so that you can see what they're doing on their own instead of mixing it all into one big pot like that.
So for the purposes of this assignment, should we separate them?
I would.
Okay.
I think it's your smarter move because, again,
You get more credit if you screw something up?
that exactly.
Okay.
He's seeing where your screw up may have occurred if it does happen, okay? Okay, let's go back to the middle of that paragraph because I know I jumped ahead. In order to accomplish this, you will incur leasing commissions of $7 a square foot. Let me call these. $7 a square foot, and prior to stabilization, and tenant improvement costs of $15 per square foot prior to stabilization. Now, I know there is question, or at least I got one last night, and got an oddly worded email from the students not here, I guess. So I'm gonna be specific on this. When you see those types of numbers, it's an annualized basis, not a monthly basis, and it should be assumed to be such. Especially when you look at the rest of the numbers, it wouldn't make sense that tenant improvements would cost you $15 per square foot per month or something like that. That would be $180 a year. That just doesn't make much sense when you're looking at the rest of the expenses out there. So, to be specific here, that's annual, not monthly. Even if it does not state it, there's a certain amount of logic here that should come into play. I'm going to get you that far in that one. Okay. I'm just going to put something here. You know, I might be wrong, but I'm just going to put it as a placeholder since we're just walking through this. Okay? You will incur these expenses in the year you are signing the lease and before they move in. Okay, now, the IE was for example purposes. I think what happened there, he did change the example that he used for the last 2 years. I too had to sit down yesterday and redo my entire spreadsheet, believe it or not. So, thanks to Starbucks for the free Wi-Fi for that. Nonetheless, from memory and looking at my old spreadsheet, I think what happened is that he basically used the same setup of this example, but he didn't change all the numbers consistently, and that's what happened here. So, scratch the IE in terms of the specific numbers. What he was trying to show you is, essentially, your vacancy is going to be this in year 1, and to lease up to this point, you're going to incur these expenses in year 1 to get to January 1st, year 2, to that 16% point. Again, a simplistic view is that everything, that 4% difference is happening on January 1st. You're signing leases by December 31st, but they're not moving in until January 1st of this year, and that's the entire 4% difference. And to get it there, you had to essentially, well, I say signing leases, your TIs will be completed and your leasing commissions will be completed by December 31st for move-in on January 1st.
So, in year 2, you don't have any expenses? Because you're incur in all of them.
Well, is
in year
that
one.
true though? In year 2 I wouldn't have any expenses?
Because year 3, you'll make more. You have 6% increase in occupancy.
How do I get from here to
Yeah.
here? Okay, so to get to a new marker,
You're going to have the expenses to the extent there's a difference in the amount of space that you've leased from year to year.
to get to +4 here,
Except for the last year's, and then that'll just be the base.
I had to spend
Mhm.
these.
Turnover cost.
To get to +6 here, so that by January 1st, year 3, I'm at this level, same situation, nobody's moved out, it's just a question of getting new people in, according to the example.
Right.
What am I gonna have to do?
You're going to have leasing commissions and TIs represented by 4% of the rentable space. So there's 80,000 square
On this one,
On 6%?
6%.
6%, right.
Yeah. So, what's gonna happen there, you gotta ask yourself. This is where I stop giving you specifics, I'm just now giving you kind of the thought process as you're looking at this, okay?
Does it help us in terms of just form with respect to doing the assignment
Mm-hmm.
to lay out what our assumptions are?
Absolutely, in
And
fact,
say, I'm assuming that the expenses are as of January 1st, and, you know, like, just to repeat.
well, the example itself is doing that for you, it's saying
Well, I don't
make
think
that
so.
assumption.
I don't think so, that's the reason why I said that. I mean, I wasn't making a decision, I just think, I could imply, I could infer from what is said that it's January 1, and that things end as of December 31st.
His assumption is January 1st, and when he's looking at this, again, using the words average one out, when he put the IE in there, that's essentially what he's
That's
trying
what
to tell you.
That's, yeah.
Okay, that's his motivation, trying to give you that example. The example screwed up a little bit, but the intent is still there to say to you, you're spending these in this year to get to this point. You're spending these, whatever they may be, in this year to get to this point,
Mm-hmm.
etc. So again, you're gonna have to do that, you know, plus 5%. To get to plus 5% in that year, you're gonna have to spend, you know, I'm gonna keep these general right now. You have to spend this and this to get to this. You have to spend this and this to get to this. Okay, what's going on here now? What starts happening in years 4 to 5, 5 to 6, 6 to
Stabilize
7?
You've got the rollover to be concerned with.
So that's why I say to you, be careful and separate it out so that you too can see what's happening here. Am I going to have to worry about these numbers anymore going forward, these specific numbers?
Not after the rollover begins.
these things suck.
It's the stabilization expenses and the rollover expenses.
Right.
And the stabilization is before you get to the 95%.
So,
Correct.
to a certain degree, mine is gonna end up looking like this,
And 4. I
where
think
X is a value and dash is no value whatsoever. You could put those values in if you wanted to, but, you know, I think what you're gonna end up doing is confusing yourself a lot more. It's up to you. I don't think you're gonna get scored down by putting dashes into these spaces, because it is showing and understanding that you've reached your stabilization point, at least in this zone.
I don't know if you can answer this question, but does the rollover not begin on January 1 of the 5th year? I think there's some confusion between year 4 and year 5. I think it takes us all of year 4 to get to stabilization,
Right?
which means that as of the first day of year 5, that's when the rollovers begin.
Does nothing
Those
happen in year
expenses.
4? What's happening in year 4, Howard?
You're paying for year 5.
Well, you're paying for the expenses to get you to, you're starting,
Same concept.
you're starting at 5% less occupancy, and over the course of that year, you're gonna get 5% more occupancy. So
Right.
that January 1 of year 5 is where you begin to be totally stabilized. And as I read it, that's where the rollover begins. So you're gonna have a rollover
okay.
factor for years 5, 6, and 7.
Here's another thing that you have to kind of take as an assumption here in a perfect world versus the imperfect world that we live in. You're never going to not have a space inside that 5% rented. So you're never going to go during this year 4 to 5 internally to 6% or 7%. You're going to seamlessly be able to, according to the assumptions here, seamlessly be able to continue at 5% this entire time. But to do that, you've had to do what?
Make tenant improvements and pay leasing commissions.
There you go. Make sure he's using the same terms. Yep. The lesser of three evils here. So, take me through these two concepts, okay? Are we gonna see any here?
No,
No.
no, no, no.
Okay.
And no again,
Is it?
I say.
Why?
Because I believe that the rollover expenses, as I understand the way this is written, would be incurred in years 5, 6, and 7. Now, I assume on January 1 of year 5 would be the first rollover year, and I'm going to lose all my tenants and then gain, not all my tenants, I'm going to lose a certain number of tenants and replace them with other tenants beginning January 1 of the 5th year.
I read it that you can just basically expect rollover of 5% at a minimum per year.
You have expiring leases, right.
What are you gonna do, though, because this is happening in between,
pay for year
between
5
years 4 and
year
5.
4.
I'm assuming, again, that on the last day of year 4, I'm losing the tenants that I'm losing, 5% of them, 5% of the dollars, 5% of the space.
But were these 4-year leases? Perhaps were there some 3-year leases involved
Don't
here?
know. Don't know.
And that's the question, and ultimately my point to you is this. There's expirations occurring that are involving,
Had they say each lease is for a 5-year term, then
that's
the answer-
different, that's different.
then
Yeah.
then I could answer your question. But without knowing that, one
You
or the
don't say
other,
anything about
it is a non-answerable question.
No, it's answerable in terms of the assumption he wants you to drive from it, which is, inside here, you got leases expiring.
Yes.
You have to do something about it. You're going to spend money to maintain that 5% all through the years going forward. And that same thing's gonna happen here, I'm gonna just call it EL here,
What does EL mean?
expiring leases.
Oh,
I'm trying to write it, but the same thing is
yeah.
horrendous. you're always having expiring leases and other things. We're gonna simplify here and say expiring meaning, evictions and everything else that might occur in those situations. But in the simplistic view is, we have expiring leases, we have to do something to either A, maintain our current tenant, or B, get a new tenant in. Now, usually TIs are only for new tenants. Understood on that. I think you're taking commercial leasing right now from Professor Smith, is it? Yeah, very useful course in retrospect after I got through my own, because a lot of the concepts you used to talk about did ring true. I got my outline out for some of that when I was setting the one up in New York. So you're going to be spending money throughout. And he's gone simplistic on you, again, giving you certain numbers. So my point to you,
I mean, it just is to keep a 95% occupancy rate, you have to pay for it the year before.
That's
or
correct.
during that year before at some point, yeah.
Well, are we to assume that all leases are for a 5-year term?
They don't have any terms of any of the leases in here. It just says
Or
occupancy
it's not a
rate.
factor, right?
Yeah.
I
It's the
assume
occupancy
it.
rate.
I assume it only to put you into a perfect world here that he's trying to put you into for the simplification of this spreadsheet. In an imperfect world, Howard, you're absolutely right. Remember what I started saying earlier. In an imperfect world, we're not going to have dashes on these. We're going to have these
Right.
numbers still showing up, no matter what. Now, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be representing the dollars per square foot maybe earlier on. I'm not going to explain to you exactly why. That's something that should kind of hit you from some of the wording of the question. But in terms of putting the actual amounts that you're attributing to leasing commissions and TIs for stabilization and leasing commissions and TIs for rollover, this is kind of how it's going to look on yours if you're trying to segregate those things for the spreadsheet point of view. Now, why might I not, or why might I, as I was saying, when I'm just putting my assumption of dollars per square foot onto the spreadsheet, why might I want to put the rollover numbers in here?
You mean in the real world?
In this example even. Why might I want to put the dollars per square foot, not the amounts attributable to them, because we're saying that's 0, 0, 0 right now. But why might I still want to put them in at least the leasing commission and TI columns right now?
Well, I mean for formulaic purposes, when you get to that time frame, then you just pick it right up. In other words,
Expand what you're saying. Pick it up for what reason?
Well, you'd want to capture the fact that you are incurring expenses in years 4, 5, and 6, and 7
Anybody
that are
see?
different from what you have been incurring.
Okay, fine, but
In other words, if you didn't put that in at some point,
why didn't I put $3.50 here and why didn't I put $5 here? Why did I put Y and Y instead?
What do you mean?
I didn't put a number. I didn't put dollars in here like I did over here.
you said
which-
it's applicable.
Why is,
Because it's probably going to be a percentage.
Why means
of
that
square footage.
there's going to be value in here.
Yes.
Why did I not put the simple $3.50 and $5 they put into the example? Why am I?
Because you want your spreadsheet to be flexible.
Okay, good. Flexible for what?
Future use changes.
What happens to numbers like these as time goes on?
Inflation? There you go.
So if I'm putting $3.50 and $5 here, what am I actually doing?
You're
Not accounting for
underestimating the
inflation.
expenses because you're not picking up the inflationary factor.
Yep.
Which was one of the questions I had, I suppose, because it was not clear that there was a compounding effect. But maybe that's what we got to think about.
Compound annually. Howard is your simple answer.
Right.
And that's why it says today's dollar. On the
It says what?
Today's dollar.
Remember, you're compounding from the year 1, not from the 4th year. So that $350 in today's dollars, when you start to apply it, is going to be $350 plus the inflation factor compounded 3 times, 4 times,
3%.
3%, 3%. So it's going to increase each year by a 1.03%. So it's 350.
Both the leasing commission and for the stabilization and the rollover are gonna increase by, so
It's a
just.
compounding effect every year.
Right, so the first year, the leasing commission is what, it's $5, it's $7, and then it'll go up to whatever, 3 cents per dollar, so 21 cents. Okay. So on our spreadsheet, we should have 4 different.
Yes.
Your setup on these ultimately is going to be your own setup. This year, actually, when I redid it, I separated out base assumptions that don't go across the board. You know, the things that we'd use dollar signs for because we're only stating them once in the spreadsheet,
That's what I'm.
versus I put a new basic heading, at least for myself, called rent and expense analysis. Something that just separates out the fact that, okay, we have the base assumptions, the true base assumptions on the percentages, the project costs, the equity, the debt, et cetera, versus the computations I'm going to have to do to get to the hard numbers of this building, the rent, the expenses, stabilization, rollover, et cetera. Okay? That's how I'm doing it. Do what makes you feel comfortable. But remember, you're going to have to drive these numbers out. Obviously, these are per year. What are you going to do with them beyond that? I'm not going to take you beyond that. That's going to be up to you now. I think I give you enough hint as to how to touch these numbers and how to think about them. Do you have any questions as far as that much goes? I would still take questions on that, at least.
I'm confused about how do we, at what rate do we account for inflation? So
It's-
this is 1.3?
It's a given,
1.03.
Oh, it's in here? Okay.
3%.
Got it.
And as Howard was asking, essentially, do you compound? What does he mean by that? Don't answer Howard.
Oh.
What does he mean by that question? Or if we're compounding or not?
Interest over interest,
Which means that should I be
taking,
taking this number and then going to this one plus 3%, etc. So that $1 became $1.03 became $1 in 6.9 cents or something like that, etc. If you weren't compounding, it would be $1.03, $1.06, $1.09, $1.12, period. That's not the way it works. Today's dollar times 3% is inflation. Then they stop again and say, okay, year two's dollar has grown again by 3%, but that was based on year two's value of that dollar, so 3% again on top of year two's number, not year one's increase. So you can see when you compound like that, things kind of go like this, not like this. Not like this, but more like this as time goes on. The curve upward. That's compounding, that's simple interest, or simple inflation in this case, or simple yield.
Yes.
So like I said, when it comes to dollar per square foot numbers that you're trying to represent on your spreadsheet, you're going to want to walk these out all the way. When it comes to the computations of how much those things are costing you per year, obviously, from what we've discussed,
Yeah.
on an annual basis,
Put a line talking about what the, like, you know, the leasing commission, so it's $7 the first year. Are you just gonna add, 3% to that in the formula, or are you gonna show it like in a separate cell?
annual stabilization is going to have value, 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 or, sorry,
Okay.
value, 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 no value, no value, no value, no value in this example.
What is, I'm sorry, couldn't read, is that annual?
Annual stabilization, annual rollover. This is where dashes and values come into play that we're talking about. Annual rollover is going to be no value, no value, no value, 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 value. To represent the fact that you're actually spending those amounts. Now, could you wrap these into one so that you just have one row of dollars going across the board? You could, but what's going to end up happening is, again, you're going to get a little messy maybe somewhere, and he's not going to be able to tell if you were accounting for stabilization dollars or rollover dollars, so you're not representing it separately. I'm suggesting to you, and only suggesting to you, be safe. I'd rather have an extra line on my spreadsheet than to lose credit. Any questions still on this? I'm happy to take them. I told you. It's just I don't want to go beyond this and give you more setup than this. I think this is again going to get you at least started on this aspect of it. You look so confused over there. What's your name again?
Matt.
Matt?
Yeah. Yeah, I might slightly be confused because I haven't really looked at it like I should have.
Ah,
Due to
man.
other circumstances.
Okay, yeah, that's okay.
So, can we just like put like whole new columns and scrap it if we want to?
The only row you mean, or?
Helen, I don't know if that.
No, on the beginning part, can we break things down differently from like words that you have us do, is basically,
Speak up because he's talking simultaneously. Can't hear you.
you know how you have like assumption, total project cost, equity, debt, interest rate?
Another new section you're basically saying?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's what I was saying to you. Last year and the year before that, I actually lumped my assumptions and my rent and expense analysis is what I'm calling it together. So I just called it all assumptions. This year I basically moved some of my assumptions up so that basically I had assumption, and it just made it into two columns to make it neater because I didn't want all my assumptions to be just this linear row going down 10, being 10 different rows. So it's basically 5 rows, but each row has 2 things on it for the assumptions. Then, when I'm starting to elaborate on annualized bases, like my rent expenses, I'll tell you right now, my first row in rent and expense analysis is monthly rent per square foot, and goes across
okay,
all 7 years. The stuff above that line didn't go across all 7 years. It was
Why,
just
why
one time.
monthly? You said monthly rent per square foot.
because he has a monthly rent per square foot.
You did it on a monthly basis?
I started on a monthly basis. I showed my work. I showed how I got there. So I went from monthly rent per square foot to monthly rent.
Oh, I see, oh, just two, okay. But if it's,
The
if
annual
you're,
rent.
if you're already given the annual rent,
Well, you weren't.
the,
Yeah, we were.
the average rent's in the local
Oh, I'm
market,
sorry.
$32
Yes,
per
you
square foot per year.
I broke it back down for some reason. You know what may have happened was last year he may have given us the monthly, so I probably broke it back
okay.
down to keep
Yeah,
it
you got me
consistent.
nervous for a minute.
Sorry about that. But annual rent at the end
Because
of
it's
the
a
day.
given at $32.
Yeah. Actually, I don't have the original
So-
paper assignment from back. I wanted to compare that aspect, but that's what probably I did there. Sorry about that.
Is
Monthly
this,
rent,
um,
monthly rent per square foot is 267?
It starts at 267, yeah.
this spreadsheet's gonna be kind of
But
different from
Alejandro,
what
you
we
don't
do in
need to-
class
you don't need to do that.
because there's a 3%
No
inflation that we account
Yeah,
for
but
across
it's
everything,
under
so it is
assumptions.
kind of like a lot different.
$32 per foot per year,
Okay.
that's all you need. You don't need the monthly rent.
Okay, so at least you're starting to
So
pick up the
everything's
fact
being done
that
on an
inflation
annual
rates, as how we call it, a red herring compared to the one that we had in class. The inflation rate's gonna play a lot of roles. You gotta figure out where it does play a role and where it may not play a role.
Right. that's
It's
the
not a
key.
red herring then though, isn't it? Just like
The rent
big,
is also,
big.
Yeah, it's
Something to think
as
about.
big a red herring as I've ever seen in terms of as important of one, but and it will play
If you
out.
don't get that,
multiple
everything
times.
I
else is
thought
off.
red herrings were like
Hidden?
stuff that's supposed to make you.
Well, if we didn't
Trick
talk
you
about it here,
better.
you would have felt like it was a red herring probably when he went through the example later on in terms of the question of compounding it, where you put it, and everything else. So that's why Howard's looking at it as a red herring. Conceptually, you're right. It's a freaking important point.
Can I ask you just in terms of a mechanical question with
Absolutely.
Excel,
Mhm.
so I understand. When you give me an example here of where you would use the dollar sign, value dollar sign, does it apply here to fit, I'd go back to my notes, but that's one thing
Yeah,
I'm not totally clear on in terms of how you use that.
In K7, because like I said, I broke out my assumptions. My assumptions look like this, okay? Mine do, at least. A1, let's call it A2, A3.
I'll hit the camera.
Value, value, value. But I came over here in the same row and did A4, A5, and A6, and put value, value, value. Balance out the spreadsheet a little bit. So all my assumptions are basically split like this. My point being this, these are one-time statements. Whenever you have a one-time statement in a spreadsheet and you're going to try to carry it across later on when you're multiplying it out, then that's when you're going to be looking to use a dollar sign almost always. Here's my best example. Building size in square feet, I have in K7, 200,000 square feet.
That's
When
a
I-
constant, in other words, that never changes.
That's a constant, it never changes, it was never brought across the spreadsheet in a way that when I go for a relative use of that number, if I try to drag it across, it's going to try to find the value that's in L7, M7, N7, etc. That's not what you want because it's only there once. So that's why you use $K, $7 in my case for building size when I'm multiplying by it or something, so that it always takes 200,000, 200,000, 200,000 is that value.
Is that different from my putting in for building size 200,000
Mm-hmm.
and then capturing that cell, getting that little cross and going across all 7 years?
If you wanted to do that, you could, but let's think about one thing. Should you have to do that?
No, I'm trying to do the shortcut. I'm trying to, so
If you brought it across like that, then you wouldn't need dollar signs because you've got 200,000 in 7 different columns.
so if I have it in my first cell,
Mm-hmm. Let's say
What do you mean in the assumption?
E something or other,
right,
E11 or
some
something.
assumption
Yeah,
cell,
and you want to put an F11 and G11 and
right?
H11
So
and drag
what
across.
would I do? I would do the dollar sign, cell number, dollar sign.
No, actually in that case, you would just drag it across and hope that Excel didn't try to change the number actually. Usually, she said on Thursday, your best bet is to put it into E, put it into F directly, and then drag it. You highlight both of those cells, then drag, because Excel will try to find the pattern that you've got. If you're going 200,000, 200,000, it's going to know, oh, okay, your pattern is you want 200,000 across all 7 columns when you drag it.
So then I'm sorry, I'm confused then. So if I want to do it the dollar sign way, and if I have $200,000 in a particular cell, but I want to have that value going across all 7 years, do I go to the cell where the assumption value is?
You
or
could.
What do I do?
But
So the question
that's
is, what do
a
I do
little
with
messy.
that? Yeah.
I would say this. You got 2 choices with an assumption like that.
Okay.
You could, like I said, I put my assumptions up top above
Yep.
this stuff, okay? But let's assume I don't want to erase that quite yet. Okay, so we got various assumptions, and I got building size. Okay, and here I've got 2 choices. I could either just put the 200,000
Yep.
right here.
Yep.
And anytime I'm going to refer to a building size to the rest of the spreadsheet, I'll just use $ for the absolute reference to that cell. Because if I'm using no $ and I'm dragging another number across that utilizes this variable, it's going to be wrong. That's when you use $, because it's here once. You can't drag something else in the way that would allow this to drag too. Or you could do this if you're scared about that and don't want to use the $, but this is, I think, is a little messier, but if it makes you comfortable and it's going to make sure you get it right, then do it. You put into E1, or whatever number, E, whatever this is, 200,000. You put into F, 200,000.
Manually do it in each cell, or
Just 2 of the cells.
to the cells?
Highlight it and
Highlight
drag
those.
it. And what will happen is it will self-populate that point 200,000. If you only did the 1 and highlighted the 1 of them, it's not going to see the pattern. So it's going to try to go 200, maybe 400,000 or 210,000 or something like that to try to assume maybe what you were trying to do. When you put it into 2 cells, here's your pattern. 200,000 plus 0 is 200,000. So 200,000 plus 0, 200,000, 200,000, 200,000, 200,000, 200,000.
So
Then you wouldn't be using $ whenever you reference this because now you have it across the board.
okay, and if I use the $, then what would I do using that same example?
You wouldn't even do this. You would just keep the 200,000 right there and go to your next row.
So I wouldn't use the $ value $.
You would use $, value, $ later on when you're referencing this number. So let's say in rent, okay, annual rent. what would your formula be?
Well, it would be the number of square feet
Right?
times the occupancy value, percentage, times the dollar per square foot value to give me my annual rent in that particular year. I mean, that's it.
Well, yeah, although I'm gonna caution you on something.
I got 200,000 square feet, let's assume.
I'm gonna caution you on something. Don't mix your vacancy number instantaneously quite yet. Show your work.
Okay, well,
Show what your full occupancy rent is, then work with your vacancy issues later on, okay? So let's say now we're taking a simplistic view of what your annual rent is. What's your formula?
the annual rent, you mean gross rent potential?
Gross, fine, if you want to call it.
200,000 times 32 dollars a square foot.
Okay. However, your dollars per square foot are probably across your entire spreadsheet, so let's
I mean,
say
that's the gross rent potential, that's 100% occupancy.
annual rent at 100%. Okay. Up here, let's say, was the number for rent per square foot on an annual basis. Let's say that's up here, okay? And obviously, since what plays a factor in rent per square foot every year?
Inflation.
Right, you're going to have to account for it across the board.
Right.
You'll have 7 different numbers going across for that one. Here, building size, I'm trying to suggest to you, since it never changes and it's a pretty easy base assumption, just leave it here once. So what you'll do here is, okay, I need to account for changes in this number that's going across 7 times, so there is no dollar sign when I'm referring to this cell, times this number, which is only there once, so you do use the dollar sign in that case. This number goes across and changes. This number doesn't change. Now maybe you'll get an example where it does someday, but in this case,
So the base numbers.
it's a base number. Base number stays the same. It doesn't move across the board. For neatness' sake, you might want to do that and keep it in the one cell and one cell only. And when you do that, you need to give an absolute reference, and the more simplistic way of saying that is use your dollar signs on your cell reference. That's what you call an absolute reference.
Okay, I got it.
Again, no, if you drag 200,000 all the way across, you could get away with doing that without the dollar sign. There are so many variables to play here, and so much computation you got to do. You got to find a way to try to keep this neat, because otherwise you're not going to print this on one page in any way, any kind of smart manner. Also, I don't know if you guys got my email, but I talked to him directly on Saturday. He also wants printouts. He talked about the CD, but he omitted for some reason when he talked to Connie. He wants printouts of your actual spreadsheet, the final spreadsheet, and also of the formula-only version of your spreadsheet. To do that, remember, you can press Control with the tilde character, and it switches the view to a formula-only view. He wants printouts of both of those when you hand in. And I would put all these things in an 8.5 by 11 envelope with your name clearly on the envelope as well.
What's the tilde? Is that the little hat? Oh, that's the, like the N on, in the, okay.
Squiggle.
Yeah.
Swiggle, okay. And you hit Control,
Control tilde will switch your view.
will give you all the formulas in each of the cells?
Is it Alejandro, is it?
Yeah, the 100.
Come here for a second if you want, and he'll show you. Do you remember that technique from your class? See what happened there?
Oh, I see, good, all right, I see, so every cell is the formula to.
Yeah,
okay.
and if he goes back, it does it again.
Control, do you hold down the control at the same time?
Yep.
Gotcha, I got you, thank you. Got it, okay.
You guys understand that from the class, remember from the class? That's going to be tougher to print. Try your best to keep it on one page as well if you can. With 70 years, it shouldn't be impossible, but it will be a little tougher. I understand that too. Yes.
Will he take instead of a disc a little jump drive or something? I don't have a.
Historically, no. you might want to try to collaborate. You got a few days here to figure out the best way to do it. Or email him and ask him specifically if that's possible. Because I was thinking about that actually the other day. That's the new nuance because Netbook's had the same problem you do over here. So either get permission from him directly, or find another way to do it. There are other ways.
I don't know whether you covered this or not, but when I was looking at the compounding effect, I mean, are we to assume that $32 per square foot is fixed over the entire time, or does that get affected also by the same?
It changes.
I mean, I assume that it did, but it says the average rents in the local market is 32, so average, does that mean?
You're getting 32 right now.
When he says, assume that there's a 3% inflation and then he lists like 4 or 5 things.
Right.
However, if you're
Basic
putting together pro
conditions.
forma, on a new building, most likely you don't know exactly what rent you're going to get. So to sell it in the first place, sell it to the bank or whatever, you're going to have to use the average amount because they're not going to take a highball unless you have a reason for a highball on that. Maybe you have a better location or something. But here, we're going to assume this is an average building in an average area that we're trying to get our financing for.
So, I mean, you obviously, I mean, with the compounding effect, you're assuming, another way of saying it would be to say that as of the average rents in the first year are $32 a square foot. By implication, I guess that's what is being said. And if that's the case, then the compounding effect has to be taken into account.
Just like every other variable number that we've looked at here gets dragged across with the compounding effect. So again, this is one of those be consistent questions, but we've always talked about being consistent in your formatting. Now let's talk about being consistent in the actual substantive stuff that goes into here. If you're going to carry across an inflation rate on certain expenses, shouldn't you do it for all expenses? And shouldn't you do it for all income deriving numbers as well? So think about that when you're trying to run through your numbers.
Well, I mean, the answer is,
Hey, would I
if
buy?
if you have fixed expenses, they're going to remain the same. They're not going to be inflation affected.
Understand what you're saying.
But I mean, I guess it's too much detail. For instance, if you had a maintenance contract or a management contract,
The 105, the
For instance,
in
let
absolute
me give you,
dollars.
let me give you for instance though,
Okay.
in the lease I dealt with, there was a quasi-fixed expense in the original one, and his expenses ended up going up, I think, 210% over 8 years on utilities. Now, I negotiated fixing them to a maximum of 3.5% per year increase, and we actually went down from what year 8 was on the start of year 1 because I called it to their attention. So basically, let's assume there was $1.05 per square foot for his space in expenses. Now the maximum, the cap on it, basically they will use the cap it will go up 3.5% per year on a compounded basis. So even though we're calling them fixed, they're fixed to that year with a maximum, or with an expense cap. Remember expense caps from commercial leasing yet? You may not have gotten there yet, but you'll hear that term thrown out, expense caps. Do you see some of the interplay you're getting between these courses, at least, with this financial analysis course, especially some of the things that you learn in other classes and whatnot? That's ultimately, and Howard will attest to this because he sat on the panel before the final project. Your final project is going to pull virtually every concept of these classes together, be it environmental, be it financial analysis, be it commercial leasing, everything.
I mean, that's the purpose of it.
Yep. And it's a very well done rat race at the end of the day, I guess is the good way of saying it.
I can't stress enough, you guys, to start it as soon as possible.
Don't wait.
Don't wait. You're just going to get slammed. It's going to be, I've sat on the panel almost every year, and you can see if there's a group that just rushed at the last second, and it just turns out to be almost an embarrassment.
And even if you're seeing that there are weak links in your team and stuff like that, don't spend more time complaining about that fact as you do actually doing the project, you suck it up, because every year, every team has one weak link, it happens,
You
it
got one
does.
superstar and one dummy, and everything.
I can't say that, but I'll say weak link.
Well, I don't mean dummy in the sense that not that they're stupid, but they're dumb about not taking the responsibility and working as hard as the others.
Lackadaisical, how's that?
Yeah, that's a better term.
I love students hate group projects.
So,
I
yeah,
mean, and also,
I hate group projects too, but you know what?
Not if you're
I-
the first link.
I look at
but
my
the real
group
world
project
is
here.
real world is teamwork. You know, that's what happens.
I look at my group project from a couple years ago as the highlight of this program, period. The final group project. The first one I wasn't so thrilled about because it just kind of didn't go right, it felt like in a lot of ways. The second one, it made us work harder, I think, because a lot of the teammates were the same between 1 and 2 for some reason. And we had architecture students on both of those, and we had some consistency there too.
Right.
The second one was far and away for us a lot better, and it's just something I'm proud of even to this day. And I'll show you some of the I was the financial analyst, although you'll still chip into the other components when you're a financial analyst, though you're going to come up with the majority of the spreadsheet stuff once they give you the actual numbers to work with. Like, I can't tell you how many parking spaces were in the building, but our architecture student came up with the number of parking spaces our building's gonna have. Then I could plug that number into a non-specific reference in the spreadsheet and have a certain number come out, and I said there, hey, is there a way we can squeeze in another 10 because we have another 10? Our IRR will be blank. And that's the type of interaction you're going to see and why these types of things are so important. Why having the ability to change just simple numbers and assumptions on the spreadsheet matter if you want to see what your IRR becomes at the end of the day.
And it's really important because one of the people on the panel inevitably is someone like Professor Foschini or someone like him or someone like that is there to do the analysis. So we've had investment bankers. Well, last year we had a guy from Cone Financial, very bright guy. That's all he did was crunch the numbers.
I mean,
And he starts asking questions, but he really got to the gut of the. And at the end of the day, the solution to the end result of this exercise is, does it make sense to do this deal or not do the deal? And there's many reasons to do it as not do it, as long as you're able to support financially and every other way.
And
What your answer is, you're okay. You don't have to say it's a good deal. You can say it's a terrible deal.
Well, in my case, though, too, we had great numbers that came out of the base assumptions we made. But I said, they're going to ask the question, worst case scenario, best case scenarios, or different things that could go up and down. What's your IRR looking like then? If you're not ready to answer that question because you're going to have to do a defense, essentially, you're pretty much swimming in shark-infested waters at that point. If you are ready, that's going to separate the men from the boys. So that's why constructing this type of pro forma, where things do hinge in terms of you can change your assumption numbers and whatnot, is very important.
Yeah.
So again, I said Thursday, this is not an Excel exercise, this is a pro forma exercise. The Excel is what's going to help you understand or get the numbers to make sense to yourself. If you had to do this by hand, you'd shoot yourself, obviously. Or I would at least.
Kind of wonder what they did in the good old days before there was Excel. I mean,
guys like Foschini in this row probably had a little bit more of an edge because they understood the numbers and could put them onto paper a lot easier than people that could just pump the numbers in. That's my view of it. People have always been able to do this, but it was longhand calculating. Excel has taken us quite a ways. And you guys were talking about Lotus back when, I think it was, before
yeah, I mean
Excel.
that was the greatest invention for especially with development deals like condominium high-rise stuff. So I would do it, and so I said, you know what, I got to show bigger profit. So I'd add another $40 a square foot on the sales, and there we go, looks great. Give that to the bank, and of course they would underwrite it and decide whether it was right or wrong. But it really allowed the developer to. It actually made him think about what the hell he was doing, but it also allowed him to present the information in such a way that almost inevitably you'd get the loan. Of course, in those days, almost inevitably you got the loan.
Yeah.
In today's
These days,
world,
it's almost impossible to
right?
get the loan.
Yeah, today it's not feasible.
Okay, one other thing I want to talk to you guys about, since I think you're kind of grasping a little bit more now some of the things that are different and in play. I want you to look at the question of net operating income. And I want you to start thinking about what that does include and what that doesn't include for the purposes of a pro forma especially. Another thing I want you to think about, and I'll go back in a sec, but another thing, because Howard, you kind of raised this tangentially, so I'm going to get more specific. How to apply your vacancy effect, and where you apply your vacancy effect in the spreadsheet, and why you're doing that. Let's take these in reverse order, because I think one is a little bit easier. I think the vacancy effect is a little bit easier to talk about. What's vacancy going to affect?
Income
True. Okay, good.
and
What kind of income specifically?
rents.
Okay, because...
And if they share the expenses, the operating expenses,
Mhm.
it's also gonna be affected.
True. Good. Okay. Now, in the issue of trying to make sure I'm teaching the true concept and not just the shorthand here, house own rent, what's exactly happening there, and what are you going to do to show it? And Howard threw around some terms earlier about something called gross potential income. Okay, what is that, and why isn't it what's going to be the final number here?
It's what you expected to be.
Or what's another way of saying it? It's actually not what we expect it to be. Gross potential income is not what we're expecting, because we're expecting this.
So it's the maximum realizable from the asset.
Correct.
In
That
any
is the
perfect
maximum number.
Okay.
Okay? So, in the real world, you should always show what your maximum is. And then apply the changes that might be occurring. In this case, that change is, or that effect on your maximum is, what's going to drive down your maximum there?
Vacancies.
Or drive down what amount would be your maximum. Your maximum will always be your maximum in this example. It's a question of what the real world is at that point. What your expectation actually is the vacancy amount. And that will make things change. And that's the difference between what we call gross potential income and effective gross income. Now, because we didn't have the vacancy numbers really filled in the class example, I don't think it was as clear, or it's as clear why we're doing all that. That's why I want to call that to your attention. Even when it was 0, he still put it in there, if I remember correctly, in terms of vacancy.
Nope.
How about mine just 0 all the way?
Yep, zeros across the board, or dashes across the
I
board.
put 0 across the board. I thought
Yeah,
you meant
but
the
it's-
formula.
No, what I'm saying though is it's there at least. You're gonna have to, you can't put a formula in there because there was no vacancy number to derive a formula from in the in the assumptions. So that's why it's 0, 0, 0, 0,
Well,
0.
it's 0, so you could put a formula in. There used to be 0.
Well, it's true. Yeah, a little stickler over here, don't we? Okay. So keep that in mind. I think that's some place where you might get a little caught up in this example. What should be included or excluded because of expenses? Tell me what really should go into net operating income. And I don't know if you ever heard these terms called above the line and below the line. Well, net operating income is the per se line. And that's the important thing to remember. And he did mention above the line and below the line very quickly in class. He said it in passing more than anything else. So I'm going to grab that, the fact that he did at least mention it, and try to at least give you some guidance as to why that's important. What do you think it all means? Why are we saying that term? Above the line, or above net operating income and below net operating income, essentially. Hold on. You feel like you're charging your stampeding horse, so we all have to pull the reins on you a little bit.
No, I hear you. I'll stand back.
Yeah, because this one's an important one to grasp, I
It's
think.
very important. It's critical, actually.
In fact, from year 1 of doing this to year 2 of being in this position last year, I screwed it up. And I was asked this question last year, and I didn't know the answer fully, and I had to go to him and ask him the question, and I screwed it up and had to fix my damn spreadsheet from year 1. So even though it didn't change from my first year of doing it to the second year of doing it, I had to alter it because I was wrong. I hate saying that. I'm Italian. It hurts even more when I have to say that.
Well, I mean,
Two. Go ahead.
the big thing is, you know, whether the property's making money before the debt.
Okay.
Right?
Well, yeah, that's part of that, good, because you're looking at the fact that there's all the cash flow before debt service, and the debt service, that's all below the line that we have called net operating income, right?
Right.
Okay, that's good. That's a good start. Why does it matter?
Well, the bank wants to know because they want to make sure if they have to take it back, that they're not going to be funding deficits for
Mhm.
one thing.
So what types of things should go into net operating income? What are we trying to show to the bank when we're calling something net operating income, if that's the case?
Well, just concept-wise, gonna make the comment that the net operating income of the asset tells the bank how much debt and how much financing is potentially available to this building in an amount that the amount of the debt will be such that the cash coming out of the building will be sufficient to cover that debt, plus, which is the debt service coverage factor we talked about.
Okay, let me simplify it a little bit, and tell me if this would be a bad simplification from your experience. Things that should go into net operating income, because basically this number is the hard number to look at insofar as what the value year to year of this property is going to be worth, or the amount of money that you're outlaying is going to be worth on this thing, should be somewhat or at least known fixed expenses and fixed income generating numbers. What should not be included in it is something that is going to be either variable or debt payment ridden, since debt amounts and interest are more particular to that particular owner and not the building itself.
You talk about the creditworthiness of the owner.
That's variable from owner to owner, and it will affect that differently. It shouldn't affect net operating income because it is so variable in the real world. So if something is known and expected, it should go above the line. If something is unknown or can be highly variable, it should be below the line. And where this causes a problem when you're looking at these spreadsheets is this. These numbers, actually starting here, this number, is that truly known or unknown? Is it fixed? Is it variable? What is this?
It's a goal, really. I mean, it's really not known, but
We couldn't even put a real function in there because there's no way to represent it really.
Have to be given.
What's that?
It have to be given
Yeah, it has
because
to be given.
it's something that you assume.
Mm-hmm. So, what's going to be derived from the vacancy number? Ultimately, these four numbers, and ultimately what their totals come out to be. So my point to you is, consider this. Though we are given a certain vacancy number, and we are given certain amounts of money that we have to spend to drive a lower vacancy to the point of stabilization, in reality, these numbers aren't really known and aren't really solid. They're, to a certain degree, you might even look at them as capital expenditures. And this is the stuff that you might want to start, when I throw a term like that out, there are some good Google references that come right up when you start looking at above the line and below the line with net operating income and what's included and what's not included, okay? So when you're looking at LCCs or stabilization expenses, be right with you, stabilization expenses or rollover expenses and stuff like that, question where you're going to put it. Does it go above the line or below the line?
Below the line.
Well, that's going to be up to you to find out. I'm not going to give you that answer. Right? I'm giving you enough to start thinking about it, though, at least. Okay. You're probably your number one thing you were going to do is assume it's an expense just like anything else and put it above the line blindly. I want you to understand why it does or doesn't go there.
With that said, should we be, well, year one, you'll know that you should know what the vacancy rate of a property is when you buy it.
Well, but remember that I think the assumption here is, okay, we're purchasing it, but we may be purchasing an empty building that we're gonna have to lease up to 80%.
In year one?
Yeah. So while you're right and wrong in terms of this example, the simplified example. And even if you know it for year one, do you know it for year two? Is there any?
Well, I was gonna ask you, if we're starting with an 80% occupancy rate, should we use that all the way through for calculating above the line and not take into consideration guessing how much we'll be able to lease it up?
You're backing me into answering the question I can't answer.
Well,
Hold on, let me think about how I'm going to say this. I'll carefully state it this way. Treat it the same way throughout, and in its entirety. Because capital expenditures are capital expenditures at the end of the day. They're one-time type expenditures. These are not necessarily repeating fixed amounts. They're only fixed insofar as we know what they cost us to replace in these cases. They are not fixed insofar as we don't know what that percentage we're going to have to replace is, or which one applies in any given year, or to what degree they apply. Whereas we know that expenses, operating expenses, are going to be $1.05 per square foot plus inflation for 200,000 square feet of building annually. Fixed, constant to a degree in terms of the expectation that they will be there, and we know those are clearly above the line because they should be negating the amount of rent that's coming into the building. What you have to ask yourself is, are these the same types of expenses? And why or why not?
I'll give you a practical example of something I've just looked at recently that may amplify what you're saying, Frank.
Yep.
Yeah. No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
I won't give the answer because I don't know the answer anyways.
Yes, you do.
But okay, so we looked at this Real World a couple months ago. We have some very substantial people I know in New York. We looked at a property that had 1,500 units in West Broward called the Resort of Pembroke Pines. And the suggested asking price, he goes through an auction.
Mm-hmm.
C.B. Richard Ellis was the, there was a broker out of Atlanta, a C.B. Richard Ellis kind of company, had it listed. And so we looked at the whole analysis and tried to determine what the real NOI is, what the above and below the line items are, what the variable costs are, what the fixed costs are. Fixed costs, there's very little that you can do about as you come into the deal and buy the property. Variable costs are costs that you may be able to do something about. And when we look at this deal, we look at what are the variable costs that we can improve upon, and what are the variable revenues we can improve upon. Raise revenue, reduce costs, because that's the upside.
I'm going to take them through that in a second because I want to show where that interplay really exists on the spreadsheet.
So the cost of the deal was like $200 million. And the value to us looking at it, and we bid 190 million, we lost, the winning bid was 193.5. So what we looked at the end of the day was, what is the existing NOI today? What is the cap rate calculation we want to figure in terms of value? But more importantly, what could we do with this property over the next 5 to 6 years? Actually, we looked at a 5-year, 7-year, and a 10-year, and made assumptions. And we did the same exercise as Frank is going through, more or less, in real world terms. But at the end of the day, these were just our assumptions. Who knows what next year's going to be, let alone 5 years from now is going to be. But the real world is that this is the kind of, the point I want to make is this is the kind of analysis and review of the financial aspects of this asset that we did in order to come to the conclusion that we should bid X dollars to try and buy this thing. And everyone looks at it from a purchasing point of view differently. We're private debt. We lost to an institutional, the mentality of an institution, a pension fund, insurance company, a lot different, but that's what we looked at.
Let me give you a concrete numerical example, because go down to upside analysis and look what happens in upside analysis. What number is the first number we have in upside analysis?
Net income, net operating income.
Okay, and that's the net operating income number. That's the line basically. There's the debt, which is below the line, isn't being really discussed in this portion of the analysis. What's happening to the net operating income number over the next two steps of this spreadsheet in upside analysis? What are we doing with it?
Copyright.
Dividing the,
Taking the occupancy rate, or multiplying it by the occupancy rate,
nope,
the gross potential.
no, go to upside analysis on the spreadsheet that you work with in class, okay? You have net operating income, right, as the first line there?
Divided by the copyright.
Sales price.
Right. That sales price later on goes where?
Well, and that's disposition value, I mean, ultimately.
It goes into your net present value analysis in the year 7, in this case, and in the IRR analysis in year 7. So let's say we screw up here, and we take, let's say our net operating income should be $1 million, and we have a cap rate of 10, just to keep it simple. Let's say we float accidentally an expense that shouldn't be in there of $200,000. Well, okay, now what did the net operating income actually become, because we included something that might not
$800,000.
$800,000. So what's the sales price going to look like?
You're gonna lose $2 million.
Well, hold on. What's the sales price? Let's do the actual numbers.
$8 million.
$8 million, right? Because 800,000 divided by 0.1, $8 million. In reality, because we shouldn't have included that expense in net operating income, what's the sales price supposed to be?
$10 million.
1 million divided by 0.1, which is $10 million. So by screwing up and putting a capital expenditure or a variable cost that was controllable to a certain degree, or controllable and so changeable, better way of saying it, by us as the owners, into that net operating income, we actually cut $2 million off the estimated sales price. That's going to cut into your IRR. It's going to cut into your net present value analysis. That's why it's important to look at above the line and below the line issues like that. That's why debt doesn't go there. We handle debt later. We do talk about, you know, what you're, how you're hamstrung by, and it does play an issue in the analysis a little bit. But the single most important thing I can point out to you is watch what you're doing with your net operating income, because that's where your IRR is going to be either made or broken at the end of the day.
Can you think of anything besides CapEx to make your example? I'm trying to think what other type of whoopses, but that's obviously the classic one. Are there other, I can't think at the moment of others that you would do a whoops on.
Well, these may be or may not be, so you got to think in that way. There are things, and that's what the debate was last year, really. Can you call these below the line type expenses? Or do you kind of know these? And just because something's stated in an example as being known per se does not mean it's actually going to be known in the real world also.
Yeah, one of the other, I mean, you might reserve for a CapEx expense but
Be
that's
way
not,
off.
but that's not a cash flow item.
No,
So in terms of, you know,
reserves generally are not.
contingencies.
Yep.
You know, a contingency, I mean, in a soft cost listing of all your soft costs, you might include that because inevitably there are things that you don't account for. Make it a percentage. Typically in this formulaically, you could say it's a percentage of your revenue or a percentage of your expenses. And
Listen, a bank is going to want to see this above. An investor or somebody trying to sell a building, developer, is going to want it below.
Yeah, but
To say whether or not it goes there or
it
not,
can't go below. It doesn't make sense for it to go below. I mean, really, at the end of the day, those types of expenses, in my opinion, run with the nature of this asset. Other than the capital expenditure, you know, as you rent up the building, you're going to be incurring more expense and more revenue, and hopefully the bottom line, NOI, will improve, you know, appropriately because revenues will go up at a greater pace in dollars, absolute dollars, than expenses associated with that extra revenue. But it gets really hairy when you're in a declining market, and there's all kinds of things that can happen in the real world that are inexplainable or can't be, reflected in this form of an Excel. I have to take my glasses off.
Mhm. That was from last year. You're fine. That's the type of thing, it's very thought-provoking though. Again, you can see
Yeah.
why it has an effect. It really does have an effect on this thing.
That's really interesting. Is that from him?
Yep. So,
Interesting.
bring that up on Friday after everything's done.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't, could you please tell me if you think I'm on like the right track with what we?
Sure, why don't I go up front actually, and if people want to leave, fine, but if you want to bring your computer up and show me what you got, I'll give you at least kind of a head nod or whatever, that you're on the right track.
Thanks, Frank, that's great, that's very helpful.
Do you have any additional questions?